What disappears first when a world is lost? Not the stones, perhaps, not the walls or the staircases or the foundations pressed patiently into earth. Those often remain, though altered, though hidden. What vanishes first may be the thread that explains them. A door found below a pavement, a window opening into soil, a street that seems to have sunk, a city whose lower rooms lie in darkness beneath the feet of the living. The mind, meeting such things, begins to circle the absence. It senses an erasure. It asks whether the ground itself once rose like water and closed over a former age. This is where the modern language of mud flood begins for many people. Not in an archive, but in an image, a photograph from the 19th century perhaps, brick buildings with basement windows half covered, grand facades whose first floors seem too low for the present street, workers standing in trenches beside exposed foundations, as if a city had been dug out after burial. The suggestion arrives quickly and with unusual force. Perhaps something happened that official history does not fully admit. Perhaps there was a lost world, not in mythic prehistory, but in the recent past. Perhaps entire chapters were covered over, literally and then intellectually, by mud. Yet the closer the question is held, the more complicated its silence becomes. The phrase itself is modern and informal, part of a loose set of claims circulating through digital culture, where old photographs, architectural fragments, excavation scenes, and damaged chronologies are arranged into a pattern of suspicion. In its stronger forms, the idea proposes a near-global catastrophe that buried cities and erased an advanced civilization from the accepted historical record. In milder forms, it expresses a less dramatic unease, a feeling that many urban landscapes contain evidence of changes not commonly explained in public memory. Between those poles lies a wide territory of uncertainty, curiosity, misreading, and genuine historical depth. What makes the subject difficult is not only that some claims exceed the evidence, but that the evidence itself can be strange. Cities are often layered in ways that feel counterintuitive until their long lives are examined closely. Streets rise, rivers move, fires destroy districts that are then rebuilt at different grades. Rubble is leveled, waste accumulates, houses are divided, repurposed, buried in part, or lifted into new urban plans. Floods lay down sediment, though rarely in the simple, uniform way popular images imply. Archaeology, when it cuts into a city, often reveals not a single disaster, but a stacked sequence of damage and repair, neglect and reuse, sealing and return. Even so, the emotional force of the question should not be dismissed too quickly. There is a reason buried cities haunt the imagination. The human record is full of interruptions. Libraries burn, palaces collapse, rivers abandon old channels, administrations vanish, taking their documents with them. Entire neighborhoods can disappear beneath reconstruction so complete that later generations barely remember what stood below. At times, the archive does indeed grow quiet where one expects it to speak. Gaps are real. Silences are real. The record is not seamless. It never has been. Long before the Internet gave the theory its name, observers were already standing over trenches and wondering what they were seeing. Early excavators in Mesopotamia found cities beneath cities, walls beneath walls, each level belonging to a different age. In Rome, medieval churches sat above ancient houses, while imperial structures sank below later streets. In Egypt, temples were buried by wind-blown sand and settlement debris. In the cities of the Ottoman world and Europe alike, old ground floors became basements as centuries altered the shape of movement above them. None of this required a single hidden cataclysm, but neither did it make the sight any less uncanny. There is also the problem of scale. A buried doorway in one city can be explained by local rebuilding. A sealed lower story in another may reflect flood control or street elevation. A mound in the Near East may represent thousands of years of occupation debris. But when the same visual motif appears again and again across countries and eras, the imagination begins to reach for one large answer instead of many small ones. That instinct is ancient. Human beings have often preferred a single lost age, a single fall, a single deluge, to the slower and more difficult truth that civilizations bury themselves in pieces for different reasons at different times, until the surface no longer remembers what it stands upon. The contradiction, then, is not trivial. The modern mud flood narrative is almost certainly too simple to hold the weight placed upon it, yet the feeling from which it grows is not invented. There really are cities beneath cities. There really are streets that rose above older thresholds. There really are excavations where the past appears not as a distant ruin on an empty plain, but as a sealed lower world directly beneath ordinary life. Something happened in all these places. The question is whether they belong to one erased event or to a deeper, more human pattern of accumulation, catastrophe, rebuilding, and forgetting. To approach that question, the record must be entered slowly, because haste is where fantasies harden. The old photographs need context. The buried windows need dates. The mounds need sequences. The cities need biographies. And once that work begins, another quieter mystery starts to emerge. Not whether the earth swallowed a lost world in one moment, but how many worlds have been partially swallowed over time, and how many of their names were never carried forward. That is where the ground first begins to open. By the 19th century, Europe and the Near East had entered a peculiar age of discovery, one in which the past no longer stood only in broken columns and isolated inscriptions. It began to descend in layers. What had once seemed like a ruined building or a stray fragment increasingly revealed itself as the uppermost edge of something far larger beneath. Excavation changed the imagination. It did not merely uncover objects. It exposed depth, and with depth came the unsettling sense that entire urban lives had been folded under the visible world and left there. Few places dramatized this more clearly than Mesopotamia. Travelers had long reported strange mounds rising from the plains of present-day Iraq, their surfaces scattered with bricks, potsherds, and carved fragments. Some were known locally by old names or associated with biblical memory. Yet only systematic digging began to show what these mounds truly were. At sites such as Nineveh, Nimrud, and later Babylon and Ur, excavators found walls, reliefs, palaces, tablets, drains, and streets appearing one layer below another. The buried city was not a metaphor. It was a literal fact of earth and architecture. But the deeper lesson was stranger still. These were not cities hidden by one simple blanket of mud. They were accumulations of centuries. Buildings collapsed and were leveled. New structures rose over old foundations. Burned debris remained where it fell. Streets shifted slightly. Occupation continued. In some places, destruction came by siege or fire. In others, the change was slower, a matter of weathering, maintenance, abandonment, and return. The mound or tell became one of archaeology's great corrections to romantic thinking. It showed that a city can vanish not only through singular catastrophe, but through repeated human use so persistent that it creates its own geology. At the same time, the great excavations of Pompeii and Herculaneum, though begun earlier, continued to influence the public imagination throughout the 19th century. There, the evidence of burial was dramatic and immediate. Streets, houses, frescoes, bodies, loaves, tools, and inscriptions had all been sealed by the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE. The dead city appeared almost paused rather than erased. It was easy to see why such a place would shape modern fantasies of sudden entombment. It offered the perfect image of a world swallowed whole. Yet it also risked misleading later observers, because Pompeii was exceptional in its mode of preservation. Not every buried threshold implied such an event. The danger lay in treating one volcanic archive as the secret model for all urban depth. Meanwhile, in Rome, another pattern became impossible to ignore. Builders, clergy, scholars, and excavators repeatedly encountered the ancient city below the medieval and modern one. Basilicas sat atop earlier sanctuaries, pagan temples became churches, streets of one century drifted above those of another. The city did not so much disappear as sink under its own continuations. Some of its monuments remained visible across time, but many of its ordinary spaces fell out of sight. Beneath familiar neighborhoods lay rooms, staircases, courtyards, and passages no longer connected to living movement. Rome became one of the clearest examples of a truth that would later matter deeply to the mud-flood imagination. A city can preserve evidence of burial without implying a hidden global disaster. This was also the century when archaeology itself was becoming more disciplined, though unevenly and often imperfectly. Earlier antiquarian digging had sometimes treated ancient sites as quarries for statues, inscriptions, or trophies. Context was damaged, layers were disturbed, notes were inconsistent. By the later 19th century, however, stratigraphy, the careful reading of layers, began to emerge as a method capable of turning Earth into chronology. Soil was no longer just an obstacle covering treasure. It became evidence. The order of deposition mattered. A sealed floor, an ash lens, a rubble fill, a drain cut through older walls. These could now be read as parts of a sequence. That development matters because it transformed buried architecture from mystery into process. A doorway beneath a modern street ceased to be merely uncanny. It became a question with historical terms. When was the threshold built? When did the street level rise? Was the fill deliberate or accidental? Did flood deposits contain river sediment, domestic refuse, demolition rubble, wind-blown dust, or all three? The ground acquired grammar. Its silence did not disappear, but it became less absolute. And yet public fascination rarely moves at the same pace as method. Newspapers, travel accounts, engravings, and later photographs carried images of excavated cities into drawing rooms and lecture halls. The buried past entered popular culture as spectacle. Civilization, it seemed, had a hidden underside. Beneath ordinary soil, there might be lions with human faces, forgotten kings, drowned streets, sealed chambers, and entire languages waiting in the dark. Some of this wonder was warranted. Some was sharpened by imperial ambition and a taste for marvels. But all of it helped establish the emotional template that would later make buried lower floors and altered street grades feel like evidence of a larger concealed story. The trenches of the 19th century did not produce the modern mud flood theory, but they taught the public something that made such a theory imaginable. The visible city was not the whole city. Beneath familiar ground, history did not stretch backward in a clear line. It descended, and once the past begins to appear vertically rather than only chronologically, the mind starts to ask a more dangerous question, not only what lies below, but how much had to be forgotten for it to remain there. The simplest explanation is often the least satisfying to the imagination, but cities are, in many cases, perfectly capable of burying themselves. Not quickly, not dramatically, not with the clean force of a single wave of earth washing over domes and avenues. They do it slowly, almost absent-mindedly, by continuing to live. A wall collapses and is cleared imperfectly. A fire leaves rubble that becomes a platform for rebuilding. A courtyard is filled to level a surface. Refuse gathers in neglected corners. Streets are repaired, then raised, then repaired again. Drains clog. New paving is laid over old. The result, after enough generations, can look uncannily like concealment. Archaeologists have long understood this process, though its texture varies from place to place. In ancient settlements across the Near East, long occupation often created elevated mounds from the remains of the mud brick buildings, ash, domestic waste, broken pottery, and collapsed walls. In medieval and early modern towns, especially those repeatedly rebuilt within confined footprints, surfaces could rise through construction debris, resurfacing, and adaptation to traffic and drainage. River cities faced another pressure. Flood management often required embankments, fills, and the adjustment of urban levels so that the line between natural sedimentation and deliberate engineering blurred over time. What is difficult for the modern eye is that the final image can be misleadingly sudden. A half-buried window does not show the centuries that raised the street outside it. A basement that was once a ground floor gives no immediate sign of the many small decisions that altered its relation to the world. The evidence is static. The process was cumulative. This is one reason buried architecture invites grand theories. The visible end state is compact, while the actual history behind it may be diffuse, local, and uneventful when taken 1 year at a time. There is also the matter of changing function. A lower level originally built above grade may later be converted into storage as exterior surfaces rise. A doorway may be blocked and replaced with a new entrance 1 step higher, then another. Shop fronts become cellars. Cellars become foundations. In some cities, what appears to be inexplicable burial is partly the result of urban adaptation. Buildings survive by surrendering their lowest portions to the changing ground. The architecture remains, but its social role shifts downward into darkness. Examples of this can be found across Europe. In older quarters of cities such as Prague, Krakow, and Paris, subterranean or semi-subterranean rooms often preserve traces of earlier street relationships. The buried spaces are real. So is the impression of dislocation. But the causes are typically historical rather than singular. Repeated paving, reconstruction after fires, modifications to drainage, fortification works, market regulation, demolition, and infill, and the quiet sediment of ordinary urban life. None of these are especially theatrical on their own. Together, over centuries, they can produce streets that stand noticeably above their earlier lines. London offers another version of the same pattern. The city has been repeatedly transformed by fire, rebuilding, demolition, sewer construction, road works, and massive 19th century infrastructure projects. Roman remains lie beneath medieval and modern levels, not because one great mud event erased them, but because the city continued to overwrite itself. The Great Fire of 1666 did not bury London under earth, but the rebuilding that followed altered plots, surfaces, and structures across large areas. Later, engineering deepened the complexity. Beneath the modern city lies an archive of floors and foundations that owes as much to continuity as to destruction. This does not mean that all buried urban fabric is easily explained in every case. Records are uneven. Smaller towns often lack detailed documentation of grade changes. Restorations may obscure original relationships. Later excavations can remove the very layers that once connected a structure to its sequence. And when photographs circulate without dates, locations, or archival context, a local engineering history can quickly harden into something much larger and more mysterious than the evidence supports. Still, the central point remains quietly powerful. Urban burial does not need to arrive from outside. A city can generate the conditions of its own concealment. Time produces surplus matter. Matter accumulates. Use becomes overuse, then residue, then stratigraphy. Human settlement, especially where it persists for centuries, tends toward layering. The ordinary leaves deposits as surely as catastrophe does. The ground rises not only because rivers overflow or mountains erupt, but because people repair, discard, pave, rebuild, forget, and continue. Perhaps this is why the subject feels so unnerving. A buried city suggests not merely that something was lost, but that loss can be produced by habit. The hidden threshold below the street may not mark a forbidden chapter. It may mark a very human one. The long, unremarkable labor by which one generation stands on the compressed remains of another, scarcely aware of what has been sealed beneath its steps. And yet there are places where the burial was not slow at all, where earth and ash arrived with a violence that still troubles the record. Not all buried worlds are made by patience. Some are made in a day, or in a season, or in the span of a few violent years when the ordinary pace of settlement is interrupted by forces that do not negotiate. Rivers abandon their banks, mountains open, hillsides give way. Earthquakes shake masonry into streets and leave districts too damaged to clear completely. In such places, burial enters the historical record not as gradual accumulation, but as shock, and the buried city becomes harder to read because catastrophe tends to compress many meanings into one layer. Flood is the most obvious candidate, and perhaps the most emotionally persuasive. Across civilizations, flood has served as both event and symbol. But in the archaeological record, real floods are often less clean than the imagination expects. They do not usually leave behind a single uniform blanket of featureless mud across entire continents. Their deposits vary by speed, terrain, sediment load, season, and human response. A floodplain city may receive silt in one quarter and destructive scouring in another. Water may carry debris, sewage, timber, animal remains, and broken masonry. The result can be a chaotic layer rather than an even one. Later rebuilding complicates it further. Some famous examples show how powerful such processes can be without implying one universal cause. In ancient Mesopotamia, several sites preserve evidence of flood deposits, and early excavators were sometimes tempted to link them to legendary deluges. At Ur, Sir Leonard Woolley identified a deep layer of silt between occupational levels and suggested that it may have inspired later flood traditions, though not all scholars accepted the broader implications he proposed. The deposit was real. The interpretation required caution. Flood in one region could be devastating enough to enter cultural memory without being global, and local catastrophe could later grow in the retelling until it resembled cosmic judgment. Elsewhere, the agents of burial are more abrupt still. Volcanic landscapes preserve some of the most dramatic sealed environments in human history. Pompeii and Herculaneum remain the best known, but they are not alone. Akrotiri on Santorini, buried in volcanic material in the late Bronze Age, offers another case where architecture, wall paintings, storage vessels, and built space were protected precisely because destruction came with sudden sealing. Such sites tempt the mind toward a simple equation. Burial means catastrophe. Catastrophe means hidden truth. Yet they also caution against overgeneralization. Volcanic ash and pyroclastic flows behave differently from river sediment. Landslide deposits differ from both. The material that buries a city always matters. Earthquakes can create another kind of silence. A city may not disappear beneath deep soil, but collapsed walls, fallen roofs, and broken infrastructure can render sections uninhabitable. If later rebuilding is partial, or if survivors shift elsewhere, the damage zone may become a low mound of rubble, gradually softened by weather and dust. Over time, what began as disaster turns into topography. Ancient Antioch, cities of the Levant, parts of Anatolia, and settlements along seismic corridors all bear witness to this less theatrical but equally consequential form of urban interruption. The ground remembers shock even when documents do not. Mud itself, in the stricter sense, can also be a direct force. Mud flows, lahars, debris torrents, and landslides have repeatedly overwhelmed settlements in mountainous or volcanic regions. In such cases, the phrase mud flood would not be entirely metaphorical. But these events are local and geologically specific. Their deposits can be studied, dated, and tied to landscapes with known risk factors. They do not easily support the idea of one recent civilization-erasing event across the globe. Still, the existence of real mud-driven disasters matters because it reminds the investigator that history has never been protected from sudden burial. The Earth has covered human places many times. It has simply done so in different ways, under different skies. What complicates everything is repetition. A city may suffer flood, then fire, then rebuilding, then abandonment, then partial reoccupation, then another flood. The final buried layer may contain traces of many episodes folded into one difficult archive. This is where interpretation becomes fragile. A dramatic photograph of excavation can suggest singular catastrophe, while the actual section wall shows centuries of alternating damage and repair. The record often resists the very clarity that later storytelling demands from it, and perhaps that is why catastrophe remains so magnetic. It offers a clean answer to a layered problem, one event, one cause, one buried age, But the ground, when read carefully, is often less obedient. It allows disaster, certainly. It records violence. It preserves moments when cities were sealed faster than memory could follow. Yet it also refuses to make all buried things the same. There is one place, however, where sudden burial became so complete and so hauntingly legible that it would shape almost every later fantasy of cities swallowed whole by earth. No buried city has done more to educate and mislead the modern imagination than Pompeii. It is the site most people think they already understand before they arrive at its evidence. A Roman town, an eruption, a single day of destruction in 79 CE streets, sealed, houses frozen, lives interrupted mid-gesture. It seems to offer the perfect model of sudden burial, the cleanest possible answer to the question of how a world can be hidden almost intact beneath later ground. But Pompeii is not only famous because it was buried, it is famous because it was rediscovered in a way that made burial itself visible, theatrical, and emotionally immediate. The excavations that began in the 18th century and continued through the 19th transformed Europe's relationship to the ancient past. Earlier ruins had usually appeared as fragments standing in open air, worn down by time into picturesque incompleteness. Pompeii was different. It emerged from below. Its walls were painted. Its streets still held wheel ruts. Its courtyards retained their shape. In some places, voids left by decomposed bodies were filled with plaster in the 19th century, producing the disturbing forms that came to define the site in popular memory. Here, burial seemed not merely destructive, but preservative. Ash and pumice had acted as both weapon and archive. Herculaneum, destroyed in the same eruption, made the lesson even stranger. Buried under deeper volcanic deposits and preserved in different conditions, it retained wooden elements, carbonized scrolls, and structures of remarkable integrity. Together, the two towns offered an almost unbearable intimacy with antiquity. The dead were no longer remote names from texts. They occupied rooms, stairways, workshops, bathhouses, and shorelines. Their disappearance could be walked through. It is not hard to see why such places became archetypes. Once a civilization has been seen preserved beneath a covering of earth and ash, the possibility begins to echo elsewhere. Every half-buried facade can start to resemble a smaller Pompeii. Every lowered doorway can seem like evidence of abrupt entombment. The psychological effect is profound. Pompeii teaches the eye to associate concealment with catastrophe, and to believe that what lies below may belong to a suddenly interrupted age. That lesson is powerful. It is also dangerous when generalized. For one thing, Pompeii's burial material was specific. The volcanic sequence included falling pumice, collapsing roofs, surges, ash, and later deposits shaped by the eruption of Vesuvius. This was not ordinary flood mud, and it was not a model for urban burial in general. For another, Pompeii was not hidden forever. Its memory survived in altered form, and while the exact location blurred over centuries, the destruction itself remained within historical consciousness through ancient sources, most famously Pliny the Younger's letters describing the eruption. The site's burial was dramatic, but it was not evidence of a vanished world omitted from all record. Even so, Pompeii did something subtler to modern thought. It suggested that the earth might hold not only broken monuments, but whole environments. A city did not have to survive as legend or scattered stones. It could survive as a sealed atmosphere, That changed expectations. Archaeology was no longer only the recovery of objects. It became, at least in the public imagination, the reopening of rooms. The buried threshold, once crossed, promised immediacy. What had been lost might still be waiting in position, with its ordinary life suspended. This helped create a cultural appetite for entombed civilizations. The 19th century, already fascinated by ruins and origins, found in Pompeii a perfect union of science, sensation, and mortality. Visitors did not merely learn history there, they experienced interruption. The city became a moral and emotional theater in which time itself seemed to have been trapped under pressure. Later generations inherited not only the archaeological facts, but the feeling that beneath the ground there may lie an erased chapter ready to rise, if only the crust above it is broken. Yet Pompeii also clarifies something important. Sudden burial can happen. It has happened. Entire built environments have indeed been sealed with startling speed. But when it does happen, it usually leaves a material signature that can be studied with some precision. The deposit has a character. The destruction has a geography. The chronology can be narrowed. This is precisely why Pompeii is so useful as a control. It shows what a real rapid burial event looks like when the evidence is abundant, and once that model is understood, many looser claims begin to look less secure. Still, there are older and stranger buried landscapes than Pompeii, places where cities were not simply covered by a disaster or forgotten beneath later paving, but slowly raised into mounds so large that they came to resemble natural hills. In those places, the earth did not merely hide the past, it was made from it. Across the plains of the ancient Near East, there are hills that are not entirely hills. From a distance they seem natural enough, soft-backed rises above the surrounding land, shaped by wind and weather into the familiar calm of earth. But when they are cut open, they reveal walls, floors, ovens, courtyards, bins, hearths, burials, and broken vessels pressed one above another in an order no natural hill could produce. These are tells, settlement mounds formed by repeated human occupation over long spans of time. They are among the clearest answers ever given to the question of how a world can be buried without vanishing all at once. The logic behind them is simple, though the result is uncanny. In regions where mud brick was a common building material, houses did not leave only dramatic ruins when abandoned or destroyed. They softened, cracked, slumped, and returned gradually to earth. Roofs fell in, walls dissolved, domestic refuse collected in and around the old spaces. New walls were then raised on top of older remains, sometimes reusing foundations, sometimes cutting through them, sometimes leveling them only partially. The site remained desirable because it already occupied a useful position near water, roots, fields, or defensible ground. So the cycle continued. Each rebuilding added depth. Each collapse contributed matter. Over centuries, sometimes millennia, a city could lift itself above the plain through the accumulation of its own past. This is not a theory, but one of archaeology's most established realities. Sites such as Çatalhöyük in Anatolia, Jericho in the Levant, and many Mesopotamian settlements preserve long sequences of occupation in vertically stacked layers. The mound is history made topographic. It holds destruction and continuity together. One neighborhood burns, another is rebuilt. One phase declines, another returns. At times the occupation contracts, at times it expands, but the overall form remains. a human hill, composed not of one burial, but of many episodes of living and leaving, each sealed imperfectly by the next. There is something almost troubling in the patience of this process. The tell does not flatter the imagination with a single lost day. It asks for a more difficult understanding. Human settlement creates sediment. Domestic life produces geology. The forgotten world beneath the feet of the present was not necessarily erased by hostile force. It may have been erased by fidelity to place. People kept coming back. They preferred the known ground, even when it was already crowded with older walls and older dead. The result is a landscape in which memory does not extend outward into openness, but downward into compressed repetition. Early excavation of tells sometimes encouraged grand conclusions that later work had to refine. 19th and early 20th century archaeologists were not always patient readers of layers. Some cut deep trenches in search of spectacular architecture or texts, damaging the subtle sequences that would later prove essential for chronology. Even when the digging improved, interpretation remained tempting. A flood deposit in one level might invite comparison with legendary deluges. A destruction layer might be linked too quickly to invasion, migration, or divine wrath. Yet over time, stratigraphic method brought a steadier discipline. The mound was no longer a treasure vault, but an archive of occupation where each layer had to be read against the others. This matters for the buried civilization imagination because tells provide a real material example of cities being swallowed by earth in a way that is cumulative, visible, and repeatable. They show that a deeply buried settlement does not require a hidden recent cataclysm. Human history can produce depth on its own, especially where architecture is fragile, rebuilding is continuous, and the same ground remains valuable across generations. The tell is almost a rebuke to impatience. It tells the investigator that one lost world may not be enough. There may be 20, one atop another, each partially remembered by the next and then forgotten in turn. And yet tells also deepen the emotional mystery rather than dissolving it. To stand on such a mound is to stand above hundreds or thousands of ordinary lives compacted into elevation. Meals cooked, walls plastered, children buried beneath floors, tools broken, rooms repaired, fires lit, wells cleaned, doors opened onto streets that no longer exist. The hill keeps all of it, but not in a form any witness could easily narrate. The archive is thick, and its voices are muffled by their number. If the tell shows how cities rise from their own ruins, Rome reveals another pattern entirely. A place where the visible continuity of civilization concealed equally deep layers below, and where the buried city remained not on the frontier of memory, but directly under one of history's most famous names. Rome has always encouraged the illusion that history can remain visible. Its name seems continuous, its monuments stubborn, its record unusually abundant. Emperors, popes, pilgrims, artists, antiquarians, engineers, and tourists have all walked across the same city while telling themselves, in different languages, that they still stood inside the ancient one. And, in a sense, they did. But Rome is also one of the clearest demonstrations that continuity can be a surface effect. Beneath the visible city lies another Rome, and beneath that another, each not wholly lost, yet no longer inhabitable in the way it once was. The process began long before archaeology gave it technical names. Ancient Rome rebuilt upon itself through fire, demolition, imperial ambition, and ordinary wear. Hills were cut, valleys were filled, drains were laid, forums expanded, temples replaced older structures, houses yielded to public works, then later to churches, towers, monasteries, streets, and apartments belonging to very different worlds. The city was never still enough to preserve itself transparently. Even in antiquity, Rome was already burying earlier Romes. After the Western Empire fragmented, much of the monumental city fell into new rhythms of use and neglect. Marble was quarried from old structures, public spaces narrowed, population contracted. Some districts became gardens, pastures, or ruin fields. Others remained active but transformed in purpose. Medieval builders worked among standing columns and broken walls, adapting what could be reused and abandoning what could not. In such a landscape, burial did not depend on one decisive catastrophe. It came from partial collapse, scavenging, seasonal deposition, rebuilding, and the steady rise of new surfaces across old ones. The result is one of the most layered urban archives in the world. Beneath churches are pagan sanctuaries. Beneath piazzas are imperial pavements. Beneath ordinary buildings lie insulae, courtyards, storerooms, workshops, drains, and rooms whose last daylight faded many centuries ago. The Basilica of San Clemente is often cited because its vertical sequence is almost didactic. A 12th century church above a 4th century church above Roman structures, including spaces associated with the Mithraic cult setting and domestic or service areas from earlier imperial Rome. It is not an isolated curiosity. It is simply one of the places where Rome's depth can still be descended in a single motion. The Forum Romanum itself also tells this quieter truth. Visitors often imagine that they are looking directly at the level of antiquity, but the story of excavation there is inseparable from centuries in which the area became silted, built over, grazed, and reinterpreted. For a long period, portions of the Forum were known as the Campo Vaccino, the cattle field. Ancient grandeur survived in fragments protruding from a lower, altered landscape. Only excavation, often guided by changing scholarly assumptions and political programs, reopened the lower city in a more legible form. Even then, what was revealed was not pure antiquity untouched by time, but a sequence shaped by burial, spoliation, and restoration. Rome matters to the buried civilization question because it dissolves a common false choice. A city does not need to be either fully remembered or wholly erased. It can be both famous and buried. Its name can remain central to historical consciousness, while many of its actual spaces disappear below later life. This middle condition is easy to overlook because it lacks the dramatic clarity of total loss. Yet it may be more typical of real urban history. Not all forgotten worlds vanish from language. Some remain celebrated while their material reality sinks out of reach. There is also a warning in Rome's example. Excavation does not simply recover the past, it rearranges it. What is uncovered gains visibility. What remains buried continues in silence. Decisions about which layers to privilege can reflect scholarly values, religious priorities, nationalism, funding, and aesthetic taste. Ancient Rome was often made more visible at the expense of later periods judged less worthy. In that sense, burial is not only geological or architectural, it can be interpretive. One era is brought into light by pushing another into shadow. This is where the subject begins to darken. The question is no longer only how cities become buried, but how later societies choose what kind of depth they wish to remember. Some layers are excavated and displayed, others are paved over again, others survive only in notes, plans, or photographs. The archive is not passive, it is curated by power as much as by chance. And if Rome shows how a city can sink through continuity, the 19th century remaking of modern cities would show something different again, that sometimes the ground was not allowed to rise on its own, but was deliberately raised, cut, or reordered until the old city was left sealed beneath a new design. The modern city is often imagined as transparent to its own making. Its streets appear planned, surveyed, documented, and rational, as though the ground beneath them had been brought under full administrative control. But the 19th century, for all its engineering confidence, was also an age of violent urban revision. Entire districts were cut down, raised up, tunneled through, filled, regraded, drained, and rebuilt according to new demands of commerce, sanitation, transport, and fire prevention. In these places, buried lower floors and altered street lines were not relics of forgotten antiquity. They were consequences of decisions made in recorded history, though even there, memory could fade with surprising speed. Seattle is one of the clearest examples. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, large parts of the city were radically reshaped through regrading projects intended to tame steep topography and improve urban circulation. Hills were cut down with hydraulic force, sediment was washed away, streets were reorganized. At the same time, after the Great Seattle Fire of 1889, rebuilding in the Pioneer Square area involved raising street levels and constructing retaining walls so that new masonry structures could occupy a more stable and sanitary urban plane above the old one. Sidewalks were built at higher elevations, while portions of the earlier street-level spaces below remained, at least for a time, as shadowed passages, basements, and service corridors. Later generations encountering these subterranean fragments could easily feel that they had entered a buried city, and in a sense, they had. But the burial was deliberate, municipal, and documented, even if not widely remembered in detail. Chicago offers a different but equally revealing case. During the mid-19th century, parts of the city were physically raised in response to severe drainage and sanitation problems. Streets, sidewalks, and in some instances, entire buildings were elevated, sometimes by feet, sometimes more. The work was astonishingly practical and astonishingly strange. Hotels, shops, offices, and blocks of masonry were jacked upward while business continued. Beneath the new grade, old relationships to the street were altered or erased. What had once been an entrance might become a basement opening. What had once been ordinary urban alignment became an architectural puzzle for later eyes. No hidden cataclysm was needed. Civic engineering alone could produce facades that now look like evidence of unexplained burial. Elsewhere, urban fires created conditions for similar transformations. Destruction on a citywide scale rarely resulted in exact restoration. Rebuilding tended to adjust street widths, paving levels, drainage systems, and structural forms. After the Great Fire of London in 1666, after fires in North American cities, after repeated destruction In European urban centers, the new city often sat slightly differently upon the old. Sometimes the changes were modest, sometimes they were profound. Rubble became fill. Debris was incorporated into new surfaces. The line between disaster residue and construction material blurred. A city could thus become buried partly by its own recovery. Paris under Haussmann is another reminder that modern urban order was frequently achieved through obliteration. Medieval streets were cut away for boulevards. Entire neighborhoods were demolished and remade. Sewer systems, foundations, and transport infrastructure restructured the hidden city as much as the visible one. Though Paris is less often cited in popular buried city speculation than some other places, it embodies the same principle. When a city is redesigned at scale, older levels do not vanish cleanly. They are truncated, sealed, absorbed, and left behind in ways that later observers may misread if they encounter only fragments. These cases matter because they narrow the mystery without removing it. They show that one does not need to invoke a forgotten global event to explain many of the photographs and architectural anomalies that circulate so widely. Half-buried windows, underground sidewalks, mismatched thresholds, sealed lower stories, and streets that appear to stand too high against their own buildings can all emerge from known histories of raising, grading, filling, and rebuilding. Yet they also reveal something less comfortable. Even where the processes were documented, the lived memory of them often faded quickly. A city can bury parts of itself in plain bureaucratic sight and still produce, a century later, a strong feeling of official omission. This is where skepticism must remain careful. To say that there are documented explanations is not to say that every local case has been perfectly explained, nor that public historical awareness is always adequate. Municipal records can be incomplete. Neighborhood histories can disappear. Restoration can obscure evidence. Visual fragments often outlive context. But the weight of the pattern is difficult to ignore. Modern cities have repeatedly manufactured buried urban space through ordinary acts of planning and repair, and yet the public imagination did not become fascinated with hidden lower worlds only because engineers raised streets. Another force was at work in the 19th century and after, a deep cultural hunger for vanished civilizations, for missing ancestors, for ruins that might reveal not just local history, but a forgotten order of the human past. By the 19th century, the buried city had become more than an archaeological fact. It had become a mood. Empires were expanding. Museums were filling. Newspapers and illustrated books carried scenes of excavation into homes far from the trenches themselves. At the same time, industrial modernity was altering daily life so quickly that the past no longer felt merely old. It began to feel displaced, as though entire human orders had slipped sideways out of time and were now being recovered in fragments. In that atmosphere, ruins were no longer just remnants. They became provocations. They seemed to hint that history was incomplete in ways more intimate and more unsettling than scholars had admitted. This was also the century that took enormous pleasure in lost races, vanished kingdoms, and forgotten wisdom. Some of these ideas emerged from genuine archaeological surprise. Others were shaped by colonial fantasy, racial theory, biblical speculation, and romantic longing. European and American readers encountered reports from Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Americas, India, and the Pacific, through narratives that often blurred observation with projection. A mound could become the vestige of an unknown people. A broken wall could be attributed to a civilization imagined as superior, mysterious, or tragically extinguished. When records were thin, imagination entered quickly. When records were rich, they were often filtered through the assumptions of those doing the describing. The buried world in this context became useful for more than curiosity. It served as a screen onto which societies projected their anxieties about origin, decline, and legitimacy. If a city lay under earth, perhaps a race had perished. If a monument stood unexplained, perhaps it had belonged to an older order than the people currently living near it. Such ideas often carried destructive implications. Indigenous histories were discounted. Local knowledge was dismissed. The visible inhabitants of a landscape were separated from the deep past beneath their own feet. Burial, in other words, could be turned into an argument for dispossession. The lost civilization became a convenient fiction for those who wished not to see continuity. At the same time, more serious scholarship was beginning to undermine these habits. Archaeology, philology, geology, and later anthropology slowly complicated the older romance of sudden disappearance. Civilizations did not simply appear and vanish like stage scenery. They transformed, merged, fragmented, migrated, rebuilt, or persisted under altered names. Yet the public appetite for the dramatic remained strong. It was easier, and often more emotionally satisfying, to imagine an erased golden age than a long sequence of adaptation and uneven survival. Literature helped fix this pattern in place. The 19th century and early 20th were crowded with subterranean worlds, lost continents, hidden chambers, and forgotten empires waiting beneath desert, jungle, or polar ice. Even when presented as fiction, these images trained the imagination to expect revelation beneath the surface. The earth became a curtain. Beneath it might lie not just evidence, but reversal, proof that the accepted order of history had missed something central. This expectation would outlast the books themselves. It would attach later to photographs, urban ruins, and unexplained architectural details with almost automatic force. The fascination was not wholly irrational. The period really was witnessing extraordinary recoveries. Cuneiform was being deciphered. Ancient languages were returning to speech through scholarship. Troy was being sought, if not always carefully. The royal tombs of Egypt and the palaces of Assyria were entering global consciousness. The dead were speaking in inscriptions, inventories, treaties, and hymns. For the first time in centuries, entire literate worlds were becoming readable again. Under such conditions, skepticism itself could feel temporary. If so much had already been forgotten and then restored, why should there not be more? This is one of the deep roots of the modern buried civilization imagination. It does not arise only from bad evidence or reckless speculation. It arises from a historically justified astonishment that the human past is far larger, stranger, and more fragile than any one generation can hold in view. The problem begins when that astonishment hardens into a single explanatory myth. Then every silence becomes proof, every anomaly becomes confirmation, and every gap in public knowledge begins to look like deliberate concealment rather than the ordinary incompleteness of the record. Still, the emotional inheritance of that earlier age remains powerful. It lingers in the way certain images unsettle the mind more than others. Staircases descending into filled earth, windows opening onto brick and soil, facades whose proportions seem wrong for the streets before them. Such things need not prove a lost world to awaken the feeling of one. And in the next stage of the inquiry, those images begin to matter very much because photographs, more than texts, are often where the modern suspicion first takes hold. A photograph has a cruel advantage over explanation. It presents the surface of a mystery all at once, stripped of duration, stripped of the years that made it, stripped even of the sounds that might have clarified it at the time. A buried window in a wall of old masonry does not arrive with municipal records attached. A doorway that seems to descend below the present street appears before the eye as a contradiction, not a sequence. The camera is impartial in one sense and profoundly selective in another. It shows what was there. It does not show how it came to be. This is why so many modern narratives of hidden burial begin with architectural images from the 19th and early 20th centuries. In these photographs, the past often looks only half absorbed. Buildings appear to have sunk. Grand facades seem truncated. Lower rows of windows are blocked by soil or pavement. In some cases, the impression is heightened by excavation trenches, construction debris, horse carts, and workers posed at awkward scale against walls whose original relationship to the street is no longer obvious. The result can feel uncanny even before any theory is applied. The image does not ask to be interpreted slowly. It pushes the mind toward a single abrupt question: what happened here? Often the answer is knowable, though not always visible in the frame. Street levels rose through repaving, grading, drainage work, and deliberate urban redesign. Buildings were remodeled, with old entrances sealed and new ones opened higher up. Basements were excavated or extended after street changes, creating misleading alignments between floors and exterior surfaces. In commercial districts, lower levels sometimes shifted function over time as retail, storage, or service needs changed. After fires or floods, debris and fill were reused. What appears in the photograph as burial may therefore represent adaptation layered over adaptation, the final still image of a long local history. Yet photographs continue to unsettle precisely because they preserve the intermediate state, the moment before complete forgetting. A fully buried lower floor converted into an ordinary cellar and stripped of visible relation to the street would not provoke the same response. But a half-buried facade does. It seems caught in transition, with the older urban logic still peering through. The eye detects a mismatch. The building is still confessing that the ground has changed around it. This is where speculation finds its opening. The problem is intensified when images lose metadata. Once detached from date, place, and archival context, they become migratory evidence, capable of being grouped with other images from very different histories until a pattern emerges that no single location could support on its own. A street-level anomaly in Seattle can be placed beside an old European cellar entrance, a partially excavated Roman structure, and a flood-damaged building from another continent. The visual rhyme is strong enough to invite one explanation across them all. The distinct biographies of the sites vanish. The photograph, freed from its record, becomes a universal symptom. This does not make the viewer foolish. It makes the viewer vulnerable to the strength of pattern recognition. Human beings are unusually sensitive to recurring forms. When enough half-buried windows are seen together, the mind begins to compress them into a single event, even if their causes differ radically. Photographs magnify this tendency because they are democratic in their surfaces. A medieval grade change, a 19th century urban raising, and an archaeological trench can all look strangely alike when flattened into monochrome rectangles. There is another complication. Photography itself arrived during a period of massive excavation, demolition, and urban transformation. Many of the surviving images that now circulate so widely were taken during works that temporarily exposed older layers of the built environment. Trenches reveal foundations not usually visible. Streets under reconstruction look partially excavated. Buildings awaiting demolition seem stranded below changing grades. The camera often captured not the settled condition of a city, but its moment of surgical disturbance. Viewed later without context, such scenes can resemble the aftermath of a concealed disaster. And still the images endure because they touch something real. They show that cities are not stable skins, but stacked negotiations with time. They reveal how easily a former world can remain present and yet no longer be legible to ordinary passage. A blocked arch, a stair dropping into darkness, a row of windows almost consumed by pavement. These are minor things, yet they carry the emotional charge of evidence discovered too late. This is why the photograph sits at the center of modern buried world suspicion, not because it proves the strongest claims, but because it preserves, in a single glance, the unsettling gap between what the eye sees and what common memory can explain. And once that gap opens, another question begins to press against it. Not only what was buried, but who later chose which buried layers should be uncovered, restored, or left in silence. Burial is never only a matter of earth. It is also a matter of attention. What lies beneath a city does not become meaningful on its own. Someone has to dig, to record, to interpret, to preserve, or just as easily to pave over and forget. This is where the inquiry moves from geology and architecture into power. The buried world is not merely discovered, it is selected. Some layers are brought into light because they flatter a nation, a faith, an empire, or an idea of civilization. Others remain below because they complicate the story those in authority prefer to tell. The 19th and early 20th centuries made this plain in ways that were not always acknowledged at the time. Archaeology expanded alongside imperial reach. European powers excavated, collected, classified, and exported on a scale that permanently altered the historical landscape of many regions. Temples, tombs, reliefs, statues, inscriptions, and everyday objects were drawn into museums far from the places where they had been found. The public was taught to marvel at the recovery of ancient worlds, and often rightly so. But the act of recovery was never neutral. It was bound up with possession, prestige, and the right to define what counted as the meaningful past. This had consequences for buried civilizations in both material and narrative terms. Excavations often privileged monumental antiquity over later occupations. A Roman forum might be cleared by removing medieval or early modern layers that were treated as clutter rather than history. An ancient temple could be isolated from the dense fabric of later life that had grown around it. Islamic, Byzantine, Ottoman, indigenous, or vernacular phases were sometimes judged secondary, intrusive, or aesthetically inconvenient compared with the classical or pharaonic remains beneath. In this way, one buried world was restored by further burying another, if not physically, than interpretively. Jerusalem offers a particularly delicate example, not because its archaeology yields easy conclusions, but because the city's layers have long been entangled with devotion, sovereignty, and contested memory. Excavation there has repeatedly intersected with political claims, religious narratives, and modern administration. The same trench can be read as scholarship, heritage work, national proof, or threat, depending on who looks at it and why. What is exposed below the city is never only ancient material. It is a live argument about belonging. The buried layer becomes charged not merely because it is old, but because it can be used to authorize the present. The same logic appears elsewhere in different forms. In colonial contexts, the deep past was sometimes narrated as belonging to vanished peoples in order to minimize the historical claims of living ones. In modern nation-states, restoration campaigns have often favored periods that support a preferred identity. In tourist economies, the layers most legible to visitors may be the ones cleared and displayed, while less marketable histories remain invisible. The buried city, then, is shaped not just by what happened long ago, but by later decisions about which past deserves architecture, signage, conservation, and light. None of this implies a single hidden conspiracy. The reasons are often practical as much as ideological. Excavation is expensive. Preservation is selective by necessity. Urban life cannot pause indefinitely for every layer beneath it. Foundations must be laid. Roads must function. People need housing, drainage, transport, and safety. In many cases, layers remain unexcavated, not because anyone wishes to suppress them, but because there is no feasible way to expose them without damaging what stands above. Institutional caution, legal restriction, and access control can therefore arise from stewardship as easily as from secrecy. Still, the result can feel similar from the outside. Corridors closed, trenches fenced, archives partial, interpretation provisional. This is one reason buried world narratives so often attach themselves to restricted spaces. A sealed room, a closed excavation, a foundation visible only to specialists, these naturally invite suspicion. The silence of the institution can resemble concealment, even where it reflects caution, limited funding, structural risk, or simple uncertainty. Yet the emotional effect is real. The public sees the barrier and senses that beneath it lies an answer larger than the one being offered. Perhaps this is the more enduring truth. History is not only incomplete because time destroys things, it is incomplete because later societies must choose again and again what to rescue from depth and what to leave there. Every city is full of unopened negotiations between the living surface and the buried archive. Some are resolved by science, some by politics, some by money, some never at all. And beneath those negotiations there persists an older current, one not confined to trenches or governments, the long human habit of remembering lost worlds through myth, especially worlds drowned, swallowed, or covered over by the anger of earth and water. Long before archaeology learned to read layers of ash, silt, and rubble, human beings were already telling stories about worlds that had gone under. The forms vary. A city sinks beneath a lake. A kingdom disappears beneath the sea. The proud are covered by flood. Towers fall. A former age is drowned, sealed, or swallowed because it had grown corrupt, or because the gods withdrew protection, or because memory itself required a landscape grand enough to hold grief. These stories do not prove the stronger versions of modern buried world theories, but they do reveal something essential about why such theories feel persuasive. Burial has always been one of the oldest shapes of cultural memory. Flood myths are the most familiar. The Mesopotamian Atrahasis tradition and the flood narrative in the Epic of Gilgamesh preserve some of the oldest surviving literary versions of a world-ending deluge, while later biblical tradition carries its own form of the same overwhelming pattern. Scholars have long debated how such stories relate to lived environmental experience. Some see echoes of regional floods severe enough to leave deep cultural marks. Others stress literary inheritance, symbolic structure, or the moral uses of catastrophe in ancient thought. What matters here is not the final resolution of that debate, but the persistence of the image itself, a human order covered over by water, with only fragments carried forward. Similar motifs appear far beyond Mesopotamia. Greek memory held Atlantis as a vanished island civilization, though Plato's account has always stood uneasily between philosophical allegory and imagined antiquity. In Welsh tradition, Cantre'r Gwaelod lay drowned beneath the sea. Breton legend remembered Ys in similar tones. Across South Asia, traditions surrounding Dvaraka wove together sacred memory, kingship, and submergence. Along many coasts, stories survive of bells heard beneath water, roads glimpsed at low tide, towers standing below the surface in older times of the year or older moods of the world. Some of these narratives may preserve distant recollections of shoreline change, storms, subsidence, or inundation. Others belong more clearly to the moral and symbolic work of myth. Most likely, many do both at once. What they share is not a common literal event, but a common human grammar. A lost world is rarely imagined as merely abandoned. It is usually covered. Earth or water closes over it. The covering matters because it preserves dignity while admitting defeat. A buried city is not reduced to nothing. It remains somewhere, intact enough in imagination to be revisited. This is why submerged bells and sealed halls endure so stubbornly in folklore. They transform irreversible loss into suspended presence. The lost place is absent, but not annihilated. This emotional structure helps explain the modern attraction of buried civilization narratives. When old photographs show streets rising against facades, or archaeology reveals one city beneath another, the evidence resonates with forms already familiar at a much deeper level of memory. The eye sees an anomaly. Myth supplies a mood. A local grade change begins to feel like part of a larger inheritance of covered worlds. The power of the interpretation comes not only from the object in view, but from the ancient readiness of the mind to believe that civilizations disappear downward. There is, however, a danger in reading myth too literally. Stories of submergence and burial are rarely archives in the modern sense. They compress ethics, cosmology, trauma, identity, and ecological memory into narrative forms that cannot simply be decoded as news reports from the past. To demand that they function as direct proof is to misunderstand both myth and history. Yet to dismiss them entirely is also too simple. Communities do store environmental experience in story. Shorelines change. Rivers migrate. Earthquakes and volcanic events leave marks that outlast precise chronology. A myth may not tell a historian exactly what happened, but it may preserve the emotional outline of living with instability. Perhaps this is why buried worlds remain so difficult to let go of. They answer a need larger than evidence alone. They allow human beings to imagine that what was lost has not vanished into meaningless absence, but waits below the threshold of ordinary sight. The city under the lake, the palace under the hill, the street beneath the present street, all belong to the same quiet reassurance. The past may be inaccessible, but it is not gone beyond all relation. And yet the modern spread of the mud flood idea cannot be explained by old myth alone. Something else has sharpened it in recent years. A new environment of images, distrust, accelerated pattern-making, and the feeling that official narratives everywhere have become too thin for the strangeness people sense beneath the surface. The modern life of the mud flood idea belongs to an age of archives without hierarchy. Old photographs, scanned maps, newspaper fragments, demolition images, excavation reports, travel engravings, and isolated architectural details now circulate in the same visual stream, stripped of the institutional ordering that once kept them separate. A Roman trench, a 19th century street raising, a flood-damaged district, and a cellar exposed during sewer works can appear side by side in the same sequence of images, each reinforcing the other through resemblance alone. The effect is powerful. It does not require forged evidence. It requires only enough true fragments arranged without proportion. This environment changes how suspicion behaves. Earlier generations encountered anomalies through books, lectures, museums, or local memory, all of which imposed some degree of context, however imperfect. The digital present reverses that order. The anomaly comes first. Context, if it comes at all, arrives later and often more weakly. A half-buried window is seen before any municipal history of road raising. A grand facade with apparently sunken lower floors appears before any account of reconstruction, remodeling, or grade change. By the time the explanation arrives, the emotional force of the image has already done its work. The question has become larger than the building. There is also a broader climate of distrust in which such theories thrive. Public institutions, governments, and even scholarly bodies are often perceived as selective, distant, or self-protective. Sometimes this perception is unfair. Sometimes history has given people reason for it. Archives have been controlled. Excavations have been shaped by politics. Museum collections do reflect unequal power. Urban histories are often poorly communicated outside specialist circles. Under those conditions, a person encountering strange evidence may find it easier to believe that the official story is hiding something than to believe that the official story is merely incomplete, fragmented, or badly taught. Pattern recognition intensifies everything. The human mind is highly skilled at detecting visual recurrence and highly vulnerable to overextending it. Once a person has seen enough buried thresholds, basement windows, sealed arches, and old city photographs, the examples begin to fuse into one system. Local causes become less satisfying than a universal one. A single missing chapter feels more elegant than hundreds of separate biographies of pavement, demolition, floodplain engineering, economic change, and rebuilding. The appeal is not only intellectual, it is aesthetic. One grand explanation imposes order on scattered unease. At the same time, modern buried world theories often borrow the prestige of real archaeology without accepting its discipline. They use authentic images, real buildings, genuine excavation scenes, and actual cases of buried urban fabric. This is part of what makes them persuasive. They do not usually begin with pure invention. They begin with something true. Cities do have hidden lower levels. Street grades do rise. Records are uneven. Archaeological interpretation can change. Institutions do restrict access. Some monumental sites remain only partly excavated. The archive really does contain silences. The difficulty is that these truths are then drawn upward into claims much larger than they can securely bear. There is another, quieter reason the idea spreads. It offers emotional relief from historical banality. Slow accumulation, municipal engineering, repeated reconstruction, and incomplete documentation are real explanations, but they do not satisfy the same hunger as a lost world suddenly covered over. Modern life is saturated with administration. Forms, permits, roadwork, debris removal, drainage plans, zoning maps, and layered repair do not feel mythic enough to explain the uncanniness of buried space. Yet history is often made of such unglamorous causes. The mind resists this because it wants the scale of the feeling to be matched by the scale of the event. And still, something important should be granted to the persistence of the theory. It reflects a genuine intuition that civilization is more fragile than public memory admits. Cities do vanish in part. Archives do fail. The visible world really does stand atop compressed histories most people will never fully know. Modern systems often present the past as cleanly narrated when it is not. The buried world imagination, even when it reaches too far, is responding to that mismatch between the polished surface of explanation and the unruly depth beneath. This is why dismissal alone rarely persuades anyone. The stronger claims may not withstand careful scrutiny, but the feeling from which they arise cannot simply be mocked out of existence. It has roots in real images, real gaps, real institutional limits, and the recurring human discovery that the ground below ordinary life is older, stranger, and less transparent than it seems. What remains, then, is to ask how much the archive can honestly explain, and where, even after the best available evidence is gathered, the record still falls quiet. The archive can explain a great deal, but it rarely explains in the manner desire prefers. It does not usually offer one sealed answer that resolves every anomaly at once. Instead, it yields fragments, layers, revisions, local records, technical studies, excavation notes, building permits, flood markers, insurance maps, engineering plans, travel descriptions, restoration reports, and just as often, silence where one hoped for clarity. The result is not a perfect defense against speculation. It is a more demanding way of living with uncertainty. On some points, the evidence is strong. Urban levels do rise over time through repaving, rebuilding, demolition debris, sanitation works, and flood management. Ancient settlements do accumulate into tells. Sudden burial by eruption, flood, landslide, or seismic destruction has happened repeatedly in human history, but under particular local conditions, leaving material signatures that can often be studied with some precision. Archaeology has uncovered cities beneath cities across many regions without needing to invoke a single recent global event. In that sense, much of what gives the mud flood idea its emotional force is already accounted for within ordinary, if far from simple, historical process. But accounted for is not the same as exhaustively explained. There are places where documentation is thin. Smaller towns may have undergone grade changes with little surviving paperwork. Informal rebuilding after disaster may leave weak archival traces. Later restorations can blur earlier relationships between threshold and street, wall and fill, basement and original ground level. Excavation itself is selective and destructive. Once a layer is opened, part of the context is irrevocably altered. In some cases, the evidence needed to settle a modern question may never have been recorded in the form contemporary curiosity demands. There is also the problem of uneven attention. Great capitals and famous monuments attract scholarship, funding, and conservation. Ordinary commercial blocks, provincial streets, industrial districts, and demolished neighborhoods often do not. Yet it is precisely in such places that many of the most provocative images originate. A half-buried facade in a little studied town may circulate widely online, while the local records needed to interpret it remain scattered, inaccessible, or lost. The absence of explanation then begins to resemble evidence of suppression, when it may instead reflect the very common historical fact that most places are not documented in proportion to how mysterious they later appear. Even at major sites, uncertainty remains part of honest scholarship. Dating can shift with new methods. Earlier excavations may prove unreliable. Interpretive frameworks change. What one generation calls flood damage, another may refine into a more complex sequence of collapse, cleaning, fill, and reuse. The archive is not a stone tablet delivered intact from the past. It is an ongoing negotiation between surviving material, available method, and the questions each era knows how to ask. This fluidity can be unsettling, especially to those who want certainty. Yet it is also one of the strongest signs that the discipline is not closed against revision. It moves because the evidence is difficult, not because the past is easy to hide. Still, the record does grow quiet in meaningful ways. Not every buried chamber can be safely opened. Not every foundation under a living city can be exposed without destroying what stands above it. Not every site can be excavated at the pace public curiosity desires. Some places remain sealed because collapse risk is real, because conservation after exposure is costly, because political conditions are unstable, or because specialists disagree about how to proceed. From the outside, such restraint can feel unsatisfying. From inside the work of preservation, it may be the least harmful option. Silence, in these cases, is not always the enemy of truth. Sometimes it is the price of not damaging what little remains. What the archive cannot finally remove is the deeper unease that buried places create. Even when the explanation is sound, the feeling persists. A basement that was once a street-level room, a church below a Roman house, a mound composed of settlements whose names are half erased. These do not cease to trouble the imagination simply because their processes are known. Knowledge clarifies mechanism. It does not erase the human experience of standing above compressed lives and realizing how little of them reached the surface whole. Perhaps that is the final discipline required here, to resist two temptations at once. One is to inflate every gap into a hidden master event. The other is to flatten every mystery into a bland administrative answer. The ground deserves better than either. It carries both explanation and remainder. It tells much. It withholds much. And in the space between those two conditions, another older thought begins to gather, that buried cities may matter not because they prove one lost civilization, but because they reveal something permanent about civilization itself. In the end, the buried city may be less a problem to solve than a condition to recognize. Human beings build in order to endure, yet almost everything they build enters, sooner or later, into negotiation with concealment. Floors sink beneath later floors. Roads rise above forgotten thresholds. Walls are reused, broken, filled against, plastered over, quarried out, or left standing in darkness beneath stronger ceilings. The visible city, no matter how confident it appears, is always only the newest agreement between memory and ground. This is why the dream of a single lost world covered by mud remains so difficult to abandon. It offers a shape equal to the feeling. It says that the strangeness has one cause, the silence one author, the buried threshold one dramatic explanation. But the earth, when approached without haste, suggests something more patient and more unsettling. There was no need for one event because there have been many. There was no need for one vanished civilization because every civilization leaves behind partially vanished versions of itself. Burial is not an exception at the edge of history. It is one of history's ordinary destinies. The stones of ancient cities do not disappear in the same way that words do. They persist badly. They remain without their sentences. A stair survives, but not the argument once held beside it. A foundation survives, but not the names of those who slept above it. A lower room remains sealed while the customs that gave it meaning dissolve almost completely. This partial survival is what gives buried places their peculiar pressure. They are not absent enough to become myth alone, and not present enough to be known without effort. They inhabit the difficult middle ground between material fact and broken remembrance. Perhaps that is why burial so often becomes symbolic in the human imagination. To be buried is not simply to be hidden. It is to exist below ordinary access, preserved in fragments, waiting for a future that may misread what it finds. Civilizations fear this not only because they fear destruction, but because they fear being translated badly by time. A city covered over may be excavated, but the life once lived in it does not return in full. The lower world rises only as evidence, never again as breath. What returns is pattern, debris, architecture, impression, and then the long labor of interpretation, always incomplete. There is humility in that recognition. The buried threshold is not necessarily proof that official history is false. It may be evidence of something harder to accept, that history is always thinner than the world it describes. Archives preserve only a fraction. Institutions narrate only a fraction. Even archaeology, patient as it is, can open only selected chambers in the vast pressure of what has been built, abandoned, ruined, and covered. Most human life passes downward with very little escort into memory. The silence is not always sinister. Often it is simply the scale of loss. And still there is comfort in the ground's refusal to erase cleanly. The lower floor remains. The blocked arch remains. The hill made of ancient houses remains. The church below the church remains. Beneath the practical surface of the living city, older worlds continue to exert a faint pressure upward, reminding each new century that it is not the first to feel permanent. The buried city does not accuse so much as warn. It suggests that endurance and disappearance are never opposites for long. They belong to the same structure. So the old photographs keep their unease, the excavated streets keep their chill. The window half below the pavement keeps looking out from its diminished height with the same impossible expression, as if it remembers a level of daylight no longer granted to it. And perhaps that is enough, not a final answer, not a secret empire swallowed whole and withheld from the textbooks. Something quieter and, in its way, more haunting, the knowledge that worlds are always passing under, not all at once, not always in violence, but steadily, while other worlds walk above them and call themselves complete. By morning, the city appears intact again. Traffic moves, foundations hold, maps agree with the surface. Yet below the measured streets, below the documented walls, below the reach of most names, the older rooms remain in their long patience. They do not demand belief. They ask only to be understood as far as the record allows, and beyond that to be felt, not as proof of one forbidden chapter, but as the enduring shape of human time itself, building, covering, forgetting, and leaving, beneath every present world, another one waiting in the dark.